Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So first things first, all that background noise that you're hearing is actually a 3D printer that's printing on the desk right next to me, and I'll explain a little bit what that's doing because it actually is for me. But first off, today is actually a digital speed paint, and this is one of the ones where I did a song in the middle of Inktober for a book that I am self-publishing with a bunch of other artists, and I'll explain a little bit about that too. I have done another video that was the first piece that I did for this series, and I'll have a link right next to me and down in the description to the first video. But today I actually have it based off of someone else's song. So like I explained in the last video, how we did it is that we each submitted a song that we wanted to illustrate, and then we all illustrated our own, and then we chose someone else's to illustrate as well. So this is the one that I chose of someone else's. So this song was by the Oh Hellos, and the song is Dear Wormwood. So it was actually really interesting to be able to look at a lot of different people's music choice, and surprisingly a lot of them really had a very similar sound to them. So this is the one that I ended up choosing. I liked a lot of the lyrics that had a little bit more deeper meaning to it, and it sounded really like there was a lot of interesting icons and elements that I could put into it and jump off from. So I did end up choosing that song, and it was actually really tough because the sound of the song itself is something very different from my own style or how I would normally like to listen to. So I was having a hard time finding a way to really show the mood and the atmosphere that was coming through in the song in my own style, because it felt like they were like kind of polar opposites. They're very different from what I imagined, because when I'm listening to this song, if you've heard it, it brought to mind, for me at least, very desaturated tones, colors like wheat yellow and some burnt oranges, so things like that, where that is a color range that I just don't work in. I don't really particularly like having pieces like that. And so while I was like trying to come up with ideas for this and thinking of subject and elements to put into it, it was actually really tough because I felt very much out of my element. I was taking inspiration for something that I don't normally find as inspirational, but not to say this in any negative way. I mean, in the end, it was actually a really great experience to take inspiration from somewhere else, from something that someone else found inspirational and exciting and interesting, and to see what I could do with it. Because with mine, I already know what songs I like. I feel like they blend well with the type of art that I do, so it was already kind of natural. They already fit. It wasn't like it was pushing me to try out new things. So by going in with a song that was very different, it definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone as far as thinking through what elements I wanted to put in the piece, how I wanted to have symbolism in it, and that was what was really cool about this one. And I will say though, is I don't think that the final piece that I created really reflects the song very well. I, in the end, decided that what I wanted to do was take that song, take it as a jumping off point, take the lyrics and the meaning that it gave me, and then do a piece that I still felt like represented myself. I didn't want to push it to the point that I felt like the piece itself didn't look like my work. It wasn't something that I felt connected with my other pieces. So I did still want it to be very connected with myself and how I do it. So I did kind of merge those two together, and yeah, like I said, I don't think it's as great of a representation of the song, but I think for me it's a really great example of me finding inspiration and ideas in some very unlikely places. So one of the elements that I got a lot of out of the song while I was listening to it, and I did study the song a lot, I listened to it a ton, and I brought up the lyrics so I could read through the lyrics as I was listening to it and really pick out different word choices that they had, themes that might not be as obvious when you're just listening to the song. So I really studied it out to try to find these little elements that would really inspire me and the piece that I wanted to do, and so I could take that and run with it and turn it into something that is mine. So while I was listening to this song, one of the themes that seemed to come up, and this is just one possible interpretation, is that the singer, the main voice of this song, that he is rising above this negative influence, this negative person in their life, and they're finding their own worth and their own value as a person, and they're moving past their own past self and becoming a better person and a more accepted person of themselves. And there's just a lot of these interesting elements of moving forward, of seeing how someone actually is in the past and being able to move beyond that. So that was something that I really resonated with, and I wanted to show that in the piece. So that's really the kernel of inspiration that I took and I jumped with for this piece. So to demonstrate that kind of concept of having someone's presence looming over you, a negative presence that you're moving past and you're trying to get beyond that, I decided that I wanted to do a portrait of a character, who, the person that I imagine as the narrator. I wanted to show him looking beyond and seeing past, and then above him having these masks that are just floating above him and having this presence that is connected to him with overall, but he's starting to see past that and starting to see a way out of that influence. So the actual execution is a little bit more abstract, I guess you could say. I definitely pushed it in a more surrealist direction, and I really liked that because it just felt like a concept that I was really excited about, and I liked the final idea of what I had going on. So yeah, and I mention this a lot, but I love the iconography of masks. I love the idea of concealment. I love the way that I can really abstract the face and the forms within it. So for me, a mask has a lot of symbolism to it about hiding oneself, about being secretive and having this mask. And I felt that that worked really well for the idea that I had of this song and some of the themes and the elements that were coming through. So that is a way that I showed these negative ideas, or it could, honestly, I kind of see it as two different ways, even though it's my own piece. I see that it could be this negative person and he's looking beyond it and moving past their influence, but I also see it as these masks could be representative of who he was in the past, who he was as he's moving past that and becoming more self-aware of what he has to put out there and his worth as a person. So I think it's kind of cool that there are several ways that you can interpret the song, and possibly several ways that you could see the piece. And a lot of times I have a hard time coming up with the color palette that I want, but this one was just really, it just flowed really well. And I think it was because I was basing his skin and his hair in a very analogous monotone color. Both his skin and his hair are very lavendery purple, and they stay that way. And because they both went really well together and they're very harmonious, it wasn't something that I was trying to make those two work and then make those elements work with the background. So because I was starting off with a slate that was already very harmonious and looked very nicely together, when I started building up on the background and everything, it just kind of came together. And I did end up doing a very cool toned palette. So I used blue, purple, and blue-green, but they were very kind of focused in that area. So it works really well to be able to have a very limited color palette in mind, so that when you're choosing colors, you can choose ones that already go well together, that are already referenced throughout your piece, because that is also a really big deal when you're working on a color palette, is you don't, well, I won't say don't, because there's not a single rule that can be adhered to all the time for art, but it's really great when you're doing color palettes where you have the same color that is referenced throughout the piece. That way you have a very harmonious look. So instead of doing like one really out of place color, unless you want that to be a focal point, you can mix that in a little bit. And for this one, there was a lot of where the color had a very similar base to it, where there was these blues and these purples that were really close together on the color palette. So by having them very analogous on the color wheel itself, it looks really seamless and smooth, and there's nothing too jarring. And that's what I really liked about it. I did end up focusing the more green tones within the mask itself so that those could stand out more, and then the background and the figure ended up being a little bit more on the cool end of the spectrum that I was using. I did end up putting a little bit of cyan in the sky behind him, but that was a great way to mirror a little bit of that warmer green tone into the background, so it wasn't so out of place for the masks, but in the end it had a very cyclical look to it, so that you'd see the cyan at the bottom of the sky and then look back up at the mask. But the sky itself was one of the elements that I loved doing the most. Once I started adding that in, it really grounded him as a character, and it it really finished it off. When I first started this piece, I didn't really have an intention for the background yet, which I should have thought that through, but when I started working on it, I started revolving around this idea of doing just the sky, and it's really simple, but once I add that, it no longer is just a guy standing in a void. He becomes part of an environment that is implied, and you can see those hints of it. So once you add hints of an environment like that, it looks like there is a world beyond it, and it tricks the eye and the mind into thinking that there's more information, there's more of an element behind him. So I love doing things like that where I add clouds like this, or moons, or just little plants, where it's just enough. When I'm doing a portrait, it's just enough to imply that there is something beyond there, rather than just a void, like I said, a person floating in space with nothing around them. So yeah, once I added that element, it was such a small detail, but it really just like reinforced the look that I wanted. It immediately gave it depth and perspective, and I love stuff like that, where once you do this little change, it immediately has this big impact on the piece. But that is pretty much it for today's video. I will have prints of him available. I've already printed a bunch off for CTN, the convention that I'm going to actually, so I'm really happy with how he turned out. He's really bright and saturated, just as bright and saturated as I wanted him to be. So yeah, if you wanted to pick up a print, you can check out the link right down in the corner of my video. That'll take you to my shop, or there's also a link down in the description as well. And like I mentioned, I am going to CTN this weekend, which is Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So if you happen to be in the Burbank area, it is an amazing convention. It has a lot of artists that are in the industry, in the animation industry, and illustrators and graphic novelists. So it's very focused on the artists themselves, and they do have a really cheap $20 ticket to get onto just the exhibitor floor. So that's really awesome. Actually, it's a great price for what you get to see and look at. But yeah, that is pretty much it. I'll talk more about the convention actually in my next video, and that is actually what my 3D printer is printing. I did mention I'd say that. It's printing off some connector pieces that I'll use in my display, but yeah, that is pretty much it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys at my next video.